it's the Wyldwych. Now, as you can tell, I'm on my selfie stick again because I can't find my tripod, which is really a pain, but it's kind of buried somewhere and yeah, I can't be bothered to find it. Anyway, the reason I'm doing this video, and I'm doing it, no makeup, no nothing, just me talking to the camera, because we've got a situation. Well, it's not a situation, but it's kind of, there's some rumblings on Tinterweb, as we call it, and I think it's important that those of us who are elder goths, those of us that were around during the 1980s and remember a lot of the bands from that time and remember the scene as it was and how it developed out of the post-punk movement, are seeing a change in how things are in the community. And to be honest, it's not necessarily a good thing. The reason that I'm commenting is because, as somebody who was there, and okay, I wasn't there right at the beginning of the goth movement because obviously it came out of punk movement. I've always been interested in music from being very, very young. So even music in the 1970s, chart music, music on the radio, whatever, I was always interested in music. So for me, I was able to explore that, and we grew up in very exciting times. I was born in 1970, and again, that was a good time musically for if you look back, it's what came out of the hippie movement, and we had progressive rock, and we had lots of very, very good, very, very big bands at those times that were very popular. Now, during the sort of 1970s, it was a very exciting time. We had glam rock, we had David Bowie breaking ground in so many different ways, being himself, but also using music as a kind of art form where he could express himself as different characters. And by exploring those different characters, he was able to kind of create different kinds of music. That's where he stood apart from a lot of other bands. Then sort of 76 onwards, we had the punk movement that came about with the Sex Pistols. This is in the UK. Obviously in America you had the Ramones, you had the acts that were going down at CBGB's, early days of Blondie, those kind of acts. It was a melting pot almost of lots of different cultures and lots of different people coming together to make music. And obviously it was an exciting time. The record companies at that time had a lot of older people still working for them, and they were just whatever makes kids happy. They kind of didn't really care whether anybody would be offended. It's just they were into they just thought, well, the kids are into it, so that's a good thing. So kind of that's how things progressed and developed. The Gothic subculture came out of the post-punk movement. When punk happened in 76, it kind of hit the world in a kind of whirlwind, and it was kind of over and done with within a 12-month period, really. If you realistically look at it, by 1978, sort of 2 years later, that was kind of it. It was all over. However, it had influenced so many people. So by 1978, we see what was called the second wave of punk, where we have artists like The Damned. Although they were around the first time round, they were producing more and more music. The Stranglers came into the second wave. The Clash was still going. Susie and the Banshees were starting to really kind of make an impact, and lots of other bands out there. We also had something where some of the perhaps older musicians were, and some of the other kids were producing what's called New Wave, which was again a post-punk movement. And so many acts came out under this New Wave movement that it was hard to define. It was very, very hard to define. So progressing forwards in 78, 79, then we start to have the early developments of bands like the Sisters of Mercy were around in 1979 in Leeds in Yorkshire, and just before the turn into the 80s, we have bands like Duran Duran starting, doing their gigs at the Rummer in Birmingham. So you're talking very, very young people who had taken elements of punk and synthesized it into something that was their own. We also had the advent of synthesizers and how they were changing the shape of music. So we had bands like Depeche Mode in the early 80s and so on. So the early 80s became this melting pot of creativity that had been started with the punk movement and then had developed with the advent of electronica. It was still a time of great innovation, and it was kind of before this cult of personality regarding the music scene. Now, when I say the cult of personality, I'm talking about the people using ways and means to become a celebrity, to become bigger than the sum of their parts, where we have people who are use the media and use things like YouTube and whatever to become bigger than the sum of their parts. So again, the music scene was a big thing. Alongside that, you had what I suppose was termed alternative fashions. A lot of those of us who grew up in those times didn't necessarily have the money to buy expensive branded goods. The likes of Gucci, and that's just one example, Dior, all the high-end designer goods were for people who could afford it. The rest of us had to make do with what we could get from whatever shops we got them from. So our style developed very individually, and some of us had a liking for vintage clothes as well. So, the thing was to buy, old ball gowns or old dresses and kind of make something from them. So there was an awful lot of DIY about it. The punk scene was about doing it for yourself and being who you are, being an individual, not following any form of fashion or any kind of societal norms. It was about self-expression and individuality. So I've seen a couple of videos recently by one was by Skullgirdle. She's did a video called An 80s Goth View of the Modern Goth Scene, using my notebook. And obviously she describes the advent of the goth culture from things like in 1983 The Hunger came out, and obviously in 1979 the first what was termed Gothic single was Bela Lugosi's Dead by the Bauhaus. Or should I say Bauhaus, not the Bauhaus, Bauhaus. Yeah, so again, it was an underground culture. It was very much it was nothing that was normal, about it. And she also suggested that a lot of the music charted, as again, because bands like Susie and the Banshees during the 80s, Susie and the Banshees were more mainstream because they'd become accepted as part of this post-punk culture. We have bands like The Cure. They started out in the late 70s. They came onto the second wave of punk, if you like, but all had a kind of gothic tag to them. So yes, it was definitely underground, and certainly towards the later side of the 80s, 85, 86, there was something that was generally gothic throughout the whole thing. These bands were charting so much. The Cure especially were charting quite heavily in the mid 80s. An album called A Head on the Door, which was very, very popular. It had songs like Caterpillar Girl and so on. Not everybody likes that stuff, but it was very poppy, so it was very accessible for a lot of people. So certainly sort of being a teenager in those times, it was great because all these bands were out there with these great songs that you could dance to, that we danced to at school discos. School discos was where we had our ability to express ourselves a little bit and, wear lots of black eyeliner and so on. But anyway, so the expectations back then were of originality. Everybody was interested in being themselves. Nobody was interested in being a clone of anybody else. That kind of came a bit later. There were a lot of original people in the 1980s. A lot of original people. For example, Skullgirdle also mentioned Boy George. Now, Boy George, I remember when he first appeared on television on a TV show called Top of the Pops, everybody was aghast. I remember my dad saying, "Is that a girl or a boy?" You know, there was no kind of, oh my God, this creature is amazing, because they look fabulous. You know, their makeup was perfect. And, you know, we didn't necessarily go for kind of a perfect look. We went for what we liked, so it would be expressive in some way. So yeah, the sort of 80s was all about being yourself, being original, and not copying anybody else. There were the odd shop. There was Phase clothing. I remember seeing adverts for Phase clothing, and things like buckle boots and you know, the sort of bondage trousers and things were still being sold. So it was kind of like a punk aesthetic that was still out there. And yeah, a lot of people still followed that and still kind of had that, but it was expensive. It was only available mail order, and it was very expensive. So yeah, what we have now, it's the difference between then and now, is now it's mass consumerism of the nth degree. There are so many online stores selling Gothic clothing, Gothic shoes, whatever. And the only issue with it is it all looks the same. A lot of online retailers are all selling certain branded goods. Now, obviously, these brands have come out from possibly people like myself who were into the scene the first time round, and we kind of developed our style and thought, do you know what? There's a market for this. Let's go for it. Well, yes, there is. The only issue with that is everybody starts to look the same. It becomes a uniform. Now, this happened in the punk scene, right? Once upon a time, punks were individuals, okay? They all had different haircuts, they all wore different types of clothing. There was no regulation to being a punk. You were a punk mainly in attitude. So a lot of it, again, this post-punk movement, the 1980s again, was about attitude and you having an attitude and opinions about things. And every person was different. But the one beauty of everybody being different is we were able to get along with other people. We might argue black is blue with black is white with people, but we would still then go down the pub, have a drink together and laugh about it, because that's what it was about. We were identifying as individuals. What I'm seeing more now is there's less individuality. There is the cult of personality through people like the Kardashians and Posh and Becks, you know, David Beckham and his wife. So much is pumped onto this. I'm a celebrity, be a celebrity. And I think the point has been missed completely. We're now putting these celebrities on pedestals, and what do they give us at the end of the day? What they give us is shallow. They're telling us to buy designer products. Get yourself into debt to buy these products. Hey, hang on a minute. I don't want to get into debt. I don't want the designer products. I don't want to buy expensive stuff. I can't afford to buy expensive stuff. I don't have the income. I've made some life choices that weren't terribly brilliant, so I'm living with the consequences of that. However, everything that I've bought, I've paid for with my own money. I don't have a massive Gothic wardrobe full of Killstar and this, that and the other brands. I have what I have. I buy a lot of clothing secondhand. I buy a lot of stuff on eBay and so on, and I look for bargains. I scour for bargains. I might buy one piece occasionally that I really like. I buy a lot of stuff from charity shops. In fact, I think I single-handedly keep charity shops in business. Because I do buy quite a bit of stuff from there. But I know that my money is going to a good cause. Kyla Carrion made a brilliant video called All My Stuff, a commentary on Gothic values. And she highlighted materialism and consumerism. Having lots of stuff is incredibly mainstream. Yet, the materialistic culture is a mainstream thing. It's, I must have this latest whatever, yeah? And we live in an age where having the latest whatever is supposed to make us feel more complete. Now, having stuff does not make you feel complete. I'll tell you that now. It is more likely to make you feel more and more insecure because there is never a limit to stuff. Yeah? There's always more stuff to get. The Gothic aesthetic seems to have gone from the scene as well. Basically not wanting to fit in, of not wanting to be part of society with society's rules. And what seems to have happened is because the Gothic aesthetic has been absorbed into the mainstream, it's now almost like, hey kids, we can sell you stuff. Hey kids, buy the latest Gothic whatever. Instead of it being about creativity, individuality and originality. The goth thing was even kind of anti-fame. Kyla brings this up in her video. If you've ever seen an interview with Andrew Eldritch from the Sisters of Mercy, he hates what goth has become. It's very easy to find stuff on the internet. He doesn't do many interviews, and when he does, he doesn't like what's happened. Basically because, as far as he's concerned, he's a musician, and musicians create music. Not everybody's going to like that music. Not everybody's going to get it. As a fellow musician myself, I know that not everyone will get to where I'm at. I don't necessarily produce Gothic music all the time. I produce music because it's what's in your heart. You're basically bringing out your artistic, creative side. So, Andrew Eldritch doesn't really like the Gothic thing, doesn't like what it's become. And there was a movement, certainly sort of from the 80s and into the 90s, where to admit that you were a goth meant that you weren't really a goth. And that's so what it was about. You know, the goths never really admitted that they were goths. It was kind of like, what do you mean? No, I'm not goth, you know. I just like dressing like this, or I like... It was very much about the anti-establishment, anti just about everything, because we were rebellious. We were rebelling against what society had told us we must do and be like. We definitely had as Kyla put it, a fuck you, I don't care if you like me attitude. I remember in the 90s walking through town dressed up in full Gothic garb on my way to a nightclub and getting jeered at by people in the street, getting, shouted out that I was the Addams Family and so on. And I used to just take it in my stride. I used to go, yeah, well, at least I don't look like you. I'm not wearing a football shirt, or I'm not, in the same uniform as everybody else. I was doing my own thing, which is what I liked about it, which is what I love about it. Why is it that there are a lot of younger people interested in being famous? Being famous, being a celebrity, is it's a bit of an albatross, really. And by that I mean, with celebrity comes, it's a double-edged sword, right? It's two sides. There's two sides to it. The one side of it is, hey, isn't it wonderful to be a celebrity and be loved and adored by millions? The other side of it is, if you put yourself up there on a pedestal, you can expect to be taken down a few pegs, because it's all about ego. Yeah, celebrity is all about ego. And if you study psychology, you'll understand that ego is what Freud termed the kind of outward self, the self that we portray to the world, the part of ourselves that is the fighting to get ahead. Yeah. And ego was a big thing in the 1980s. When we had the yuppie movement and the, let's all knock 'em dead, and let's all kind of, all the, the sort of high-end echelons of society, very ego-driven. I'm better than everybody else. And I'm better than everybody else because, yeah? Now, Kyla asked very interesting questions. One is, why are you attracted to this counterculture? Because the Gothic is counterculture. It is anti the establishment, anti the established culture, anti the mainstream. For me, it was about the music initially. The clothing kind of came a bit later, as you know, kind of spending money on your own clothes happens, and developing your own sense of style happens. And it does change. It does change over time, yeah. And it's about embracing that and embracing the darker aspects of life and contemplating life and death, contemplating the dark sides of psychology, contemplating the horror of reality, of war, and just the darker aspects of life, the occult, the hidden, that which is hidden, that which is underground. In this day and age, it is very difficult to stand alone and to stand on your own 2 feet and be yourself without having a constant stream of abuse or general denigration for being different and for being yourself. I've faced it in real life very often. And because I've not wanted to be part of the mainstream, be part of a particular clique or group, I personally have received some quite nasty comments from people. And I've had people falling out with me over it. And I've said, look, just because I don't want to be part of that group or scene doesn't mean that I'm falling out with people. I'm not falling out with people. I'm just being myself. And these days it seems that there's much more of a herd mentality. I'm from a time, as I said previously, that we would argue over things and then go down the pub and have a drink together, because that was what we did. It was fun. It was, to have a difference of opinion meant that it made conversation interesting. We didn't all believe the same things. We didn't all have the same values. We had different morals, different values, and we would sit and talk about it. That's what we did. And that's lacking, I think, in today's society. Because we're pumped 24/7 in this society with the internet, with everything of, you must have this, you must do this, you must be this, all the time. And I think it's very difficult for us to resolve that. Kind of also asks the question, what does it mean to you to be Gothic? To me, it's individuality. Not being the same as everybody else. Standing apart and not being afraid to stand apart. Enjoying the music. As a musician myself, I am very interested in the musical aspects of it. The cultural aspects of it. The being a fan of horror movies and horror novels and Gothic literature and every aspect of it. I'm not necessarily interested in driving a hearse. You know, I've got a car, it works, so I'm not, I'm not fussed. Having an original thought, which is so rare these days, to have an original thought. So many people don't have original thoughts, but they don't realise that they're not having original thoughts because they're being controlled by the media, by what's out there, by newspapers and television and so on, that's, you know, feeding you what you should be and how you should be. And my advice is, turn it all off. Start thinking for yourself, because being Gothic is about thinking for yourself. It's about being yourself, dressing how you want to dress, wearing makeup, not wearing makeup, not fitting in. It's not about fitting in. The problem we have is there's this whole kind of, you must fit in to do this. You to be accepted in society, you must be fit. You don't have to be accepted in society. This is what has been lost. You've got to be yourself. If you're yourself, you're an individual having an experience of life. That is vital. It's important that you have great experiences. Whatever that means, you know, however you do it. Enjoy your life. Be who you are. And don't take any crap from anybody, yeah? You are strong, you're an individual, make it work for you. I'm going to sign off here. I think there's probably more that I'm going to add to this conversation as it kind of develops. So yeah, this has been quite a serious video, but I think it's important to address these points for certainly younger people in the community that are struggling with their own identity. And we're become a society where we've had a lot of people telling us how we should be, or there's so many tutorials out there for this and the other. So many Gothic makeup tutorials. When we were kids, there was no Gothic makeup tutorials. We had to invent it ourselves.